Texas, 1944. When the military trucks rolled through the gates of the converted ranch that now served as a prisoner of war camp, the German soldiers inside believed they were entering another kind of hell. Among them sat Otto Schäfer, 29, a wheat farmer from Dresden whose calloused hands had known only honest work before the war swept him into its machinery. As the vehicle bounced along the dirt road, kicking up clouds of red dust that settled on his worn uniform, Otto stared through the canvas covering at the endless expanse of prairie grass and mesquite trees. He had heard stories, whispered rumors in the cramped transport ships about American labor camps where prisoners were worked to death under the merciless sun. What he didn't know was that this patch of scorched Texas earth would teach him something the war had stolen from his memory, that dignity could survive even between enemies. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we retell the human stories forgotten by war. The truck came to a grinding halt beside a cluster of wooden barracks that looked more like a frontier settlement than a prison. Otto's fellow prisoners, mostly young men from Bavaria and Prussia, climbed down with the same mixture of fear and resignation that had carried them through months of uncertainty. The camp stretched before them like a small town, simple wooden buildings arranged in neat rows, a mess hall with smoke rising from its chimney, and beyond the perimeter fence, the vast Texas landscape rolling toward a horizon that seemed to promise either freedom or endless captivity. Sergeant William "Bill" Rodriguez, a second-generation Mexican-American from San Antonio, approached the group with an interpreter. Unlike the harsh camp commandants Otto had imagined, Rodriguez wore his authority lightly, his weathered face showing more curiosity than contempt as he studied the new arrivals. "Welcome to Camp Riverside," he said through the interpreter, his Spanish accent softening the English words. "I know you boys are probably expecting the worst, but we do things different here in Texas." Otto watched as Rodriguez gestured toward the surrounding landscape, where cattle grazed peacefully in nearby pastures, and the afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. "See, we got ourselves a problem," the sergeant continued, removing his hat to wipe the sweat from his forehead. "War took most of our ranch hands, and harvest season don't wait for nobody. We got crops to bring in, cattle to tend, and not enough men to do it. Now, the Geneva Convention says we can put y'all to work, but it also says we got to pay you fair wages for fair work." The German prisoners exchanged glances, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Otto had steeled himself for backbreaking labor without compensation, for guards who saw them as nothing more than useful animals. The mention of wages seemed so foreign, so impossible, that several men began to whisper among themselves in rapid German, wondering if this was some kind of cruel joke or psychological torture. "Tomorrow morning, those who want to work can sign up," Rodriguez announced, his tone matter-of-fact, as if he were addressing hired hands rather than enemy soldiers. "Field work pays 75 cents a day, livestock work pays $1, and skilled trades pay $1.50. Money goes into your camp account, and you can spend it at the canteen or save it up." He paused, studying their bewildered faces. "I know it ain't much, but it's honest pay for honest work. That's the way we do things here." As the prisoners were led to their assigned barracks, Otto found himself walking beside a thin man named Friedrich Weber, a clockmaker from Munich whose gentle manner reminded him of his own father. "Did you understand what he said?" Friedrich whispered, his voice barely audible above the crunch of their boots on the gravel path. "Wages? For prisoners?" Otto nodded slowly, his mind struggling to process this unexpected development. Throughout his capture and transport, he had prepared himself mentally for the worst: slave labor, starvation rations, guards who would see his humanity as weakness to be exploited. The possibility of being treated as anything more than a conquered enemy had never entered his calculations. Their barracks turned out to be surprisingly clean and well ventilated, with real beds instead of straw pallets and windows that let in both light and air. Each man was assigned a footlocker and a small area to call his own, more personal space than Otto had enjoyed since leaving Germany. As evening approached and the prisoners settled into their new quarters, the conversation inevitably turned to the day's revelations. "It has to be a trap," muttered Hans Kruger, a former factory worker whose suspicious nature had kept him alive through 3 years of fighting. "Americans don't pay their enemies. They're probably planning to work us to death and then claim we died from natural causes." But Otto found himself thinking about Sergeant Rodriguez's weathered hands and the way the man had looked at them, not with hatred or disgust, but with the practical assessment of a rancher evaluating potential workers. There had been something genuine in the sergeant's manner, a straightforwardness that reminded Otto of the farmers he had known back home, men who judged others by their willingness to work rather than their politics or nationality. As darkness fell over the camp and the sounds of the Texas night began, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through mesquite branches, the call of night birds, Otto lay on his narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel something other than fear or resignation. It was a fragile emotion, barely more than a whisper in his heart, but it was there nonetheless. Hope. Outside, the stars burned brilliant and clear in the vast Texas sky, and somewhere in the distance, a cowboy's guitar played a lonely melody that seemed to bridge the gap between languages and loyalties. Otto closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time he had felt truly human, truly valued for something other than his ability to carry a rifle and follow orders. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions he had never dared to ask. Could enemies treat each other with dignity? Could honest work restore a man's sense of worth? Could wages paid to a prisoner mean something more than money? The Texas sun had barely cleared the horizon when Otto found himself standing in line outside the camp's administrative building, joining nearly 24 other prisoners who had decided to test Sergeant Rodriguez's promise of paid work. The morning air carried the scent of sage and the distant aroma of coffee from the guards' quarters, creating an oddly peaceful atmosphere that seemed at odds with everything Otto had expected from captivity. Friedrich Weber stood beside him, nervously adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as they waited. "My grandfather always said that Americans were practical people," the clockmaker whispered. "Perhaps that's all this is. Practical necessity." Otto nodded, though part of him still wondered if they were walking into some elaborate form of punishment disguised as opportunity. When their turn came, they found themselves facing Sergeant Rodriguez and a civilian Otto hadn't seen before. A tall, lean man in his 50s, wearing a worn cowboy hat and boots that had clearly seen years of hard use. His name, they learned through the interpreter, was Tom Henderson, owner of the Double H ranch that bordered the camp. His sun-weathered face bore the lines of a man who had spent his life working outdoors, and his handshake, when he greeted each volunteer, was firm but not aggressive. "Boys," Henderson said, his voice carrying the slow drawl of East Texas, "I ain't gonna lie to you. The work's hard, the sun's hot, and the hours are long, but I pay every man who works for me, regardless of where he comes from or what uniform he used to wear. You do right by me, I'll do right by you. That's a promise." Otto found himself assigned to a crew harvesting cotton on Henderson's ranch, alongside 4 other German prisoners and 2 Mexican-American workers who had managed to avoid the draft due to essential agriculture status. The crew leader, a middle-aged man named Carlos Ramirez, showed them how to use the cotton sacks and explained the quota system with patient professionalism that surprised Otto with its lack of hostility. "The trick," Carlos explained through gestures and the few German words he had picked up from previous prisoner work crews, "is to keep moving steady, not fast. Fast workers burn out by noon. Steady workers last all day and make more money." He demonstrated the proper technique for picking cotton, his experienced hands moving efficiently through the plants while he continued talking. "Mr. Henderson, he don't care if you're German, Mexican, or from the moon. He cares if you work honest and don't complain too much about the heat. The first morning was brutal. Otto's soft hands, unused to this type of labor since his farming days before military service, quickly developed blisters despite the work gloves Henderson had provided. The Texas sun seemed to press down like a physical weight, and the repetitive motion of picking cotton created aches in muscles he had forgotten he possessed. But something unexpected happened as the hours passed. Instead of the degradation he had anticipated, Otto began to feel a familiar satisfaction, the same sense of purpose he had once found in his wheat fields back in Dresden. During the lunch break, as the work crew gathered in the shade of a massive oak tree, Henderson himself appeared with a thermos of cold water and a smile that seemed genuine rather than calculated. "How y'all holding up?" he asked, squatting down beside the group with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. When Otto struggled to express his gratitude for the work gloves in broken English, Henderson waved off his thanks. "Son, a man can't work proper without proper tools. That's just common sense." It was Carlos who translated Henderson's next words, and Otto would remember them for the rest of his life. "He says you work like farmers, not like soldiers. That's good. Farmers understand the land, understand that you got to take care of things if you want them to take care of you." By the end of that first day, Otto's cotton sack weighed nearly 60 pounds, earning him $1.20, more money than some German soldiers made in a week during the war. But it wasn't the amount that mattered, it was what the payment represented. As Sergeant Rodriguez counted out the coins into Otto's palm, the simple transaction felt like a restoration of something essential that had been stolen from him during years of military service. That evening, as the prisoners returned to camp, dust-covered and exhausted, but strangely satisfied, Otto made his way to the camp canteen for the first time. The small store, run by a matronly American woman named Mrs. Patterson, offered basic necessities and small luxuries: soap, toothbrushes, candy bars, and even tobacco for those who smoked. When Otto placed his $1.20 on the counter to purchase a bar of soap and a chocolate bar, Mrs. Patterson smiled at him as if he were any other customer. "First day's wages?" she asked kindly, and when Otto nodded, her smile widened. "Well, you earned it honest. That's something to be proud of." She counted out his change with the same respect she would show any paying customer, and Otto found himself fighting back unexpected tears. It had been so long since someone had treated him like a person rather than a problem to be managed or an enemy to be defeated. That night, as Otto lay in his bunk eating his chocolate bar, slowly to make it last, Friedrich Weber approached him with obvious excitement. "Otto, did you hear what happened to Klaus?" he whispered, referring to a fellow prisoner who had been assigned to livestock work. "Henderson's foreman taught him to ride a horse today." A horse! Can you imagine? Klaus, who had never seen a cow before the war, riding an American ranch horse like a cowboy. Otto smiled, savoring the sweetness of the chocolate on his tongue. What did Klaus say about it? He said it was the first time since his capture that he felt free, even for just a few minutes. The foreman told him that good horsemen are worth their weight in gold on a ranch, regardless of nationality. Friedrich paused, his voice dropping even lower. "Otto, I think these Americans might actually see us as human beings." As the conversation continued around him, prisoners sharing their experiences from their first day of paid work, Otto reflected on how profoundly his expectations had been challenged. He had prepared himself for exploitation, for being treated as slave labor, for guards who would work them to death without a second thought. Instead, he had found employers who provided proper tools, fair wages, and even small kindnesses like cold water on a hot day. The chocolate finished, Otto carefully folded the wrapper and placed it in his footlocker, a small memento of dignity restored through honest work. Tomorrow would bring another day in the cotton fields, another opportunity to earn wages that represented far more than their monetary value. For the first time since his capture, Otto Schäfer dared to believe that even in captivity, a man could maintain his humanity through the simple act of being valued for his labor. Outside, the Texas night embraced the camp with its vast darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played a melody that seemed to speak of hope persisting even in the most unlikely circumstances. Now, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day this story found you. It's curious to know how far these human memories reach. 3 weeks into his routine of dawn-to-dusk cotton picking, Otto discovered that the most valuable currency at Camp Riverside wasn't the 75 cents he earned each day, but something far more precious: respect. It arrived in small gestures that accumulated like drops of water filling an empty well. A nod from Henderson when he passed a particularly productive row, Carlos teaching him a few words of Spanish during lunch breaks, and Mrs. Patterson at the canteen, who had begun to remember his name and his preference for soap over candy. On this particular morning, Otto faced an unexpected challenge that would test everything he had learned about dignity in captivity. A new group of prisoners had arrived the previous evening, 40 men from a captured submarine crew, pale and hollow-eyed from weeks in transport. Among them was Lieutenant Hans Dietrich, a career naval officer whose rigid posture and contemptuous expressions made it clear that he viewed the working prisoners as collaborators rather than survivors. "Look at you," Dietrich sneered as Otto prepared for another day in the fields, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, taking American money like a hired servant. "Have you forgotten that you're a German soldier? Have you forgotten your duty to resist?" Otto paused in lacing his work boots, considering his response carefully. The other prisoners in the barracks had gone quiet, watching the confrontation with nervous interest. Friedrich Weber, loyal friend that he had become, moved closer to Otto's bunk in a gesture of silent support. "I remember being a farmer before I was a soldier," Otto replied quietly, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I remember that honest work feeds families and builds communities. Here, I'm still a farmer, even if the land is American and the crop is cotton instead of wheat." Dietrich's face flushed red above his naval uniform. "You're being used. Can't you see that? They're making you complicit in their war effort while they hold you captive. It's a violation of everything we fought for." Otto stood slowly, meeting the lieutenant's eyes with calm resolve. "What exactly did we fight for, Lieutenant? I fought because I was ordered to fight. I killed because I was ordered to kill. But here, I work because I choose to work, and I'm paid because my labor has value. For the first time in years, I feel like a man rather than a weapon." The confrontation might have escalated further, but Sergeant Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the barracks. "Morning, boys," he said casually, though his sharp eyes took in the situation at a glance. "Otto, Carlos is asking for you specifically on the cotton crew today. Says you got the best hands for quality picking he's seen in a while." The simple acknowledgement of Otto's skill and value diffused the tension more effectively than any argument could have. As Otto gathered his work gloves and water bottle, he noticed that several of the newer prisoners were watching him with curiosity rather than contempt. Dietrich retreated to his bunk, but his disapproval remained palpable. Later that morning, as Otto worked steadily through rows of cotton plants that stretched toward the horizon, Carlos approached him with a proposition that would challenge his understanding of his place in this strange new world. "Otto," the crew leader said, switching to the mixture of English, Spanish, and German that had become their common language, "Henderson wants to know if you'd be interested in learning to operate the cotton gin. It's skilled work, pays $2 a day." Otto straightened, his back protesting the sudden movement after hours of bending over cotton plants. $2 a day was more than many skilled workers made back in Germany, even before the war. But more than the money, the offer represented something profound: trust. Operating the cotton gin required understanding complex machinery, working independently, and being responsible for processing the labor of an entire crew. "Why me?" Otto asked, genuinely puzzled. There are men here with more mechanical experience, men who speak better English. Carlos smiled, an expression that had become increasingly common as their working relationship deepened. Henderson says you got what he calls steady hands and a thinking mind. Says the way you pick cotton, careful like making sure you don't damage the plants, that tells him you understand that today's work affects tomorrow's harvest. That's the kind of man he wants running his equipment. That afternoon, Otto found himself standing beside the camp's cotton gin, a massive mechanical device that separated cotton fibers from seeds with impressive efficiency. Henderson himself provided the training, patiently explaining each component and safety procedure with the thoroughness of someone who understood that knowledge, like respect, had to be earned. This here's the heart of the whole operation, Henderson explained, his hands moving confidently over the controls. Treat her right, and she'll process more cotton in an hour than a dozen men could clean by hand. Treat her wrong, and she'll shut down the whole harvest. He paused, studying Otto's face. You think you're ready for that kind of responsibility? Otto nodded, accepting the weight of trust that came with the opportunity. Yes, sir. I won't let you down. Henderson's weathered face creased into a genuine smile. Son, I don't think you could let anybody down if you tried. You got the look of a man who takes pride in doing things right the first time. Durl, as the days passed and Otto mastered the intricacies of operating the cotton gin, he became aware that his role in the camp was changing. Other prisoners began to seek his advice about work opportunities, and even some of the guards started greeting him by name rather than by number. The $2 a day he earned wasn't just payment for his labor, it was recognition of his value as a skilled worker and a trustworthy individual. The transformation wasn't lost on Lieutenant Dietrich, who watched Otto's growing status with increasing bitterness. One evening, as Otto returned from the gin operation covered in cotton dust, but carrying himself with quiet pride, Dietrich confronted him again. Look at yourself, the naval officer said with disgust. The Americans have bought you completely. They give you a little responsibility, a little extra money, and you forget that they're still our enemies. Otto paused at his footlocker, considering his response as he changed out of his work clothes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that commanded attention from everyone in the barracks. Lieutenant, with respect, I think you're wrong about what they've bought. They haven't bought my loyalty to their cause. They've bought my respect for their character. Every morning, Henderson trusts me with equipment worth more than most people make in a year. Every evening, he pays me fairly for work well done. That's not propaganda or manipulation. That's how decent people treat each other, even in wartime. Friedrich Weber, emboldened by Otto's example, added his own perspective. I work in the camp carpentry shop now, Lieutenant. Yesterday, when I cut my hand on a saw blade, the American medic treated me with the same care he would give his own soldiers. When I tried to thank him, he said that injured men need healing, regardless of what uniform they wear. How is that our enemy talking? The conversation continued late into the night, with prisoners sharing their own experiences of unexpected kindness and professional respect from their American captors. Some, like Dietrich, remained convinced that it was all an elaborate psychological manipulation. Others, like Otto, had begun to see it as evidence that humanity could survive even the most dehumanizing circumstances. As Otto finally settled into his bunk, his day's wages carefully stored in his growing savings, he reflected on how profoundly his understanding of captivity had changed. He had expected to be broken down, reduced to a number in a system designed to extract labor without regard for dignity. Instead, he had been built up, recognized for his skills, trusted with responsibility, and treated as a valuable member of a community that transcended national boundaries. Tomorrow would bring another day of operating the cotton gin, another opportunity to prove himself worthy of the trust Henderson had placed in him. But tonight, Otto Schäfer fell asleep, not as a prisoner of war, but as a skilled worker who had earned his place through competence and character. The Texas stars burned overhead, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, a wild sound that spoke of freedom existing even in the most constrained circumstances. By October, the cotton harvest was reaching its peak, and Otto had become Henderson's most trusted equipment operator. The transformation was remarkable, not just in his technical skills, but in the way he carried himself, with the quiet confidence of a man whose work was valued and whose contributions mattered. The cotton gin ran smoothly under his care, processing bale after bale of pristine cotton that would eventually find its way to textile mills across America. But it was on a crisp autumn morning, with the smell of wood smoke drifting across the camp and the leaves on the oak trees beginning to turn gold, that Otto encountered a situation that would test everything he had learned about dignity, respect, and the complex nature of human relationships during wartime. A new prisoner had arrived, not part of a group this time, but a solitary figure who immediately stood out from the other inmates. Captain Ernst Müller was a former Luftwaffe pilot whose plane had been shot down over the English Channel 3 months earlier. Unlike the submissive demeanor of most recent arrivals, Müller carried himself with the rigid bearing of someone who refused to acknowledge defeat, even in captivity. "I've heard about you," Müller said when he was assigned to the same barracks as Otto. His voice carried the cultured accent of a Prussian education and the barely concealed contempt of someone who viewed any cooperation with captors as betrayal. "The farmer who's become the American's pet prisoner. How does it feel to collaborate so openly?" Otto looked up from the letter he was writing, his first correspondence home since capture, made possible by his accumulated wages and the camp's male privileges for cooperative prisoners. "It feels like honest work for honest pay," he replied calmly. "Something I thought I'd never experience again." Müller's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Honest work? You're helping them process cotton that will be turned into uniforms for American soldiers, tents for their camps, supplies for their war effort. Every bale you process helps them kill more German boys. How is that honest?" The accusation hit Otto harder than any physical blow could have. He had been so focused on the immediate satisfaction of skilled work and fair treatment that he hadn't fully considered the broader implications of his labor. That night, as he lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, Müller's words echoed in his mind with uncomfortable persistence. The next morning, Otto approached Henderson with questions that had been troubling him through a sleepless night. The rancher was checking the morning's cotton delivery, his experienced eye evaluating the quality of fiber that would determine the day's market price. "Mr. Henderson," Otto began hesitantly, his English now good enough for complex conversations after months of daily practice. "May I ask what happens to the cotton we process?" Henderson looked up from his clipboard, his weathered face showing mild surprise at the question. "Well, son, most of it goes to civilian textile mills. Cotton's cotton, whether it's peacetime or wartime. Folks need clothes, bed sheets, work shirts. Some of it probably does end up in military contracts. Can't lie to you about that. But most of it's just regular commerce." Otto nodded, but his expression must have revealed his continuing discomfort, because Henderson set down his clipboard and gave him his full attention. "Something troubling you, Otto? You've been working like a man with something heavy on his mind." Taking a deep breath, Otto shared Captain Müller's accusations and his own conflicted feelings about contributing to America's economic capacity during wartime. Henderson listened without interruption, his face thoughtful as he considered the moral complexity of the situation Otto described. "Son," Henderson said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had wrestled with similar questions, "that's probably the most intelligent concern I've heard from any prisoner in this camp. Shows you're thinking like a man with a conscience, not just following orders or doing what's easiest." He gestured toward the fields where cotton plants stretched toward the horizon. "But let me ask you something. If you don't work, does that stop the war? Does that save lives on either side?" Otto considered the question seriously. No, sir, it doesn't. That's right. And here's something else to consider. Every German prisoner who works for fair wages, who's treated with dignity, who goes home after this war with a different understanding of what Americans are like, that might prevent the next war. Might help build a world where German farmers and Texas ranchers can trade cotton and wheat like civilized people instead of trying to kill each other. Udi, Henderson's words carried a perspective that Otto hadn't considered, the idea that current cooperation might plant seeds for future peace. But the rancher wasn't finished with his thought. Plus, Henderson continued, you're earning money that you can send home to help your family survive whatever's happening in Germany right now. That cotton gin you're running so well? The wages from that work might keep your wife fed or your children clothed during the hardest winter of their lives. Is that collaboration, or is that being a responsible man taking care of his people? That evening, Otto found himself in an unexpected conversation with Captain Muller. The pilot had spent his first day assigned to basic field work, picking cotton by hand under the supervision of Carlos, who had treated him with the same patient professionalism he showed all new workers. Muller's hands were blistered. His uniform was stained with dirt and plant matter, and his rigid posture had softened somewhat under the weight of physical exhaustion. It's harder work than I expected, Muller admitted, examining his raw palms in the fading light. The Mexican crew leader, Carlos, he didn't treat me like a prisoner, kept offering me water, showing me better techniques. Even shared his lunch when mine wasn't enough. He paused, his voice carrying a note of confusion. Why would he do that for a German pilot? Otto smiled, recognizing the same bewilderment he had felt during his first days of paid work. Because he's a decent man who sees you as another human being doing difficult work under a hot sun. It's not complicated, Ernst. Sometimes kindness is just kindness. As the weeks passed and Muller settled into the rhythm of camp life, Otto watched the pilot's rigid certainties begin to soften under the influence of daily interactions with Americans who treated him fairly and paid him honestly for his labor. It was a transformation Otto recognized because he had lived it himself, the gradual realization that enemies could be honorable, that captors could be just, and that dignity could survive even in the most unlikely circumstances. One afternoon, as Otto supervised the cotton gin's operation while Muller worked nearby in the fields, Henderson approached with news that would change Otto's understanding of his place in this strange community they had built together. Otto, the rancher said, his voice carrying an unusual note of formality, I've been talking with the camp commander about your work here. We've got a proposal for you, if you're interested. There's a program starting up. Skilled prisoners who want to stay in America after the war, help with reconstruction and development. Good workers with character references from their employers. He paused, studying Otto's face. I'd be willing to sponsor you, son. Help you get started with your own farm, maybe, or a position running equipment for one of the big agricultural operations. What do you think? Otto felt his world shift beneath his feet. The possibility of staying in America, of building a new life in a country that had shown him more respect and opportunity than his homeland had offered in years, was both thrilling and terrifying. But even as he considered Henderson's generous offer, his thoughts turned to his wife and children back in Dresden, to the farm that might still exist despite the war's devastation, to the life he had built before politics and conflict had torn his world apart. Thank you, Mr. Henderson, Otto said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. That means more to me than you can know. But I have a family waiting for me in Germany. I have to try to rebuild what was broken there before I can think about building something new here. Henderson nodded, his expression showing understanding rather than disappointment. I figured that's what you'd say, son. That's what makes you the kind of man worth making the offer to in the first place. But if things don't work out back home, you remember you got friends in Texas. That night, Otto wrote another letter home, this one filled with stories of American cowboys who had treated him with dignity, Mexican-American workers who had shared their knowledge and their lunch, and a ranch owner who had offered him a future he had never dared to imagine. As he sealed the envelope, he realized that whatever happened after the war, he would never again think of Americans as faceless enemies. They had become individuals with names and stories, people who had shown him that humanity could transcend the artificial boundaries created by politics and warfare. The harvest continued, and so did Otto's education in the complex relationship between captivity and freedom, between enemies and friends, between the man he had been and the man he was becoming under the vast Texas sky. The first frost came early to Texas that November, coating the remaining cotton plants with a crystalline sheen that reminded Otto of winter mornings on his family's farm in Dresden. As he walked to the cotton gin in the pre-dawn darkness, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air, he reflected on how much had changed since his arrival at Camp Riverside 8 months earlier. The scared, defeated prisoner who had stepped off the transport truck had been replaced by a confident equipment operator whose skills were respected and whose opinions were valued by both prisoners and staff alike. But it was on this particular morning, with the harvest season drawing to a close and rumors of Germany's imminent surrender spreading through the camp like wildfire, that Otto would face the most challenging test of everything he had learned about dignity, loyalty, and the true meaning of freedom. Captain Muller approached him as he prepared the cotton gin for what would likely be one of the last major processing days of the season. The former Luftwaffe pilot had changed dramatically during his months of fieldwork, his rigid military bearing softened by daily interactions with Carlos and the other members of the cotton-picking crew who had accepted him as simply another worker. "Otto," Muller said, his voice carrying an unusual note of urgency, "have you heard the latest news from the front? Berlin is falling, the Reich is collapsing. Some of the men are saying we might be going home within months, maybe weeks." Otto nodded, continuing his methodical inspection of the gin's mechanisms. The possibility of repatriation had been a constant undercurrent in camp conversations, but recent reports suggested it might become reality sooner than anyone had expected. "Yes, I've heard the rumors. What of it? Don't you understand what this means?" Muller pressed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We could be free men again. No more work details, no more American supervision, no more living in barracks like livestock. We could go home to our families, rebuild our lives as Germans in Germany." Otto paused in his work, considering Muller's words carefully. The prospect of reunion with his wife and children filled him with longing so intense it was almost painful. Yet something about Muller's phrasing troubled him. The assumption that his current life was somehow less free, less dignified than what awaited him in a devastated Germany. "Ernst," Otto said slowly, "what exactly do you think freedom means?" Muller looked at him as if the question were absurd. "It means not being a prisoner. It means making your own choices, living where you want to live, working for yourself instead of for your captors." Otto smiled, an expression that carried both sadness and wisdom earned through months of unexpected education. 8 months ago, I would have agreed with you completely. But now, he gestured toward the cotton gin, humming efficiently as it processed the morning's first load of raw cotton. "This machine represents more freedom than I had in Germany before the war. Henderson trusts me with equipment worth thousands of dollars. He pays me wages that recognize the value of my skills. When I make suggestions about improving efficiency, he listens and often implements my ideas. How is that less free than being conscripted into an army I didn't choose to serve?" The conversation was interrupted by Henderson's arrival, but Otto could see that his words had disturbed Muller deeply. The rancher greeted both men with his customary warmth, but Otto noticed an unusual seriousness in his demeanor as he approached. "Boys," Henderson said, removing his hat in a gesture Otto had learned to recognize as a sign of important news, "I got word from the camp commander this morning. There's going to be an announcement later today about repatriation schedules. Looks like the war's winding down faster than anybody expected, and Washington's starting to plan for sending y'all home." Otto felt his heart skip a beat, but Henderson wasn't finished speaking. "Now, I want you both to know that regardless of what the official timelines say, you got jobs here as long as you want them. The war ending don't change the fact that good workers are hard to find, and both of you have proven yourselves to be good workers and good men." Henderson's weathered face showed genuine emotion as he continued. "Otto, especially, I want you to know that offer I made about sponsoring you for permanent residency still stands. You're welcome to stay and help us build something good here." As Henderson walked away to continue his morning rounds, Otto found himself facing the most difficult decision of his adult life. The logical choice seemed obvious: return to Germany, reunite with his family, attempt to rebuild the life that war had shattered. But the months at Camp Riverside had shown him possibilities he had never imagined, a society where hard work was rewarded regardless of nationality, where dignity was preserved even in captivity, where former enemies could become trusted colleagues. That afternoon, the official announcement confirmed what everyone had suspected. Germany had surrendered unconditionally, and repatriation of prisoners of war would begin within 60 days. The news sparked celebrations among some prisoners and profound anxiety among others, as men who had built new identities as valued workers contemplated returning to a homeland that no longer existed in any recognizable form. Otto found himself sought out by dozens of fellow prisoners seeking advice about the future. Some, like Lieutenant Dietrich, remained convinced that any cooperation with Americans had been a betrayal of their German identity. Others, like Friedrich Weber, had begun to question whether returning to the ruins of Germany was truly the best path forward. "What will you do, Otto?" Friedrich asked as they sat together in the camp's recreation hall, watching other prisoners play cards and discuss their uncertain futures. "Henderson's offer is generous. You could bring your family to America, start fresh in a country that has shown you respect." Otto stared out the window at the Texas landscape that had become so familiar, the endless rows of harvested cotton fields, the grazing cattle, the vast sky that seemed to promise unlimited possibilities. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to stay, to build something new in a place where I've found dignity and opportunity. But another part of me feels that I owe it to my family, to my homeland, to help rebuild what was destroyed." Their conversation was interrupted by an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Patterson from the camp canteen, carrying a small, wrapped package. "Otto," she said with her characteristic maternal warmth, "I heard about the repatriation announcement. I wanted to give you something before you start making your final decisions." Inside the package was a photograph, a picture of Otto operating the cotton gin, taken without his knowledge during the height of harvest season. In the image, he appeared completely absorbed in his work, his face showing the concentration and pride of a skilled craftsman at the peak of his abilities. Below the photograph, Henderson had written in his careful script, "To Otto Schaefer, the finest equipment operator and most honorable man it has been my privilege to employ. May your future be as bright as your character deserves." As Otto stared at the photograph, he realized it captured something profound, not just his image, but his transformation from a defeated prisoner into a valued member of a community. The man in the photograph looked confident, purposeful, and fundamentally free in ways that transcended physical circumstances. That evening, Otto made his decision. He would return to Germany to search for his family and assess the possibilities for rebuilding his old life. But he would carry with him the knowledge that dignity and opportunity could exist even in the most unlikely circumstances, and that former enemies could become trusted friends through the simple act of treating each other as human beings deserving of respect. As he prepared for sleep, Otto carefully placed the photograph in his footlocker alongside his accumulated wages and the letters from home that had finally begun arriving through Red Cross channels. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as he navigated the complex process of repatriation. But tonight, he felt profoundly grateful for the education he had received in the cotton fields of Texas. Outside, the November wind whispered through the mesquite trees, and Otto realized that regardless of where his future lay, he would never again doubt that humanity could survive even the most dehumanizing circumstances. The Cowboys of Texas had taught him that dignity was not something that could be taken away by circumstances. It was something that could only be surrendered, and Otto Schäfer had learned never to surrender it again. If this story moved you, hit the like button. It helps Otto's story reach more people and remember what war tried to erase: our humanity. Subscribe to the channel, hit like, and tell us in the comments which part touched you most. Because sometimes peace begins when we retell the past with empathy.